Welcome back. Well, it is tempting to think that government could run more like a business, but are there things that governments do best? And where is the line between the public and the private sector? And by the way, who should draw it? John Manley is a former Deputy Prime Minister and former head of the Business Council of Canada. Thanks for being with us, John.
Thanks, Amanda. I've really been on both sides of that divide.
Well, it's why you're so great to speak to on this, because you've seen it from both sides, and there is always this temptation to say some of the private sector gets everything right, and if only government could run more like the private sector. So I wanted your perspective on that. Is that true? Could there be more of a private sector mentality in government, or is the very nature of government that it can't be that way?
Well, it can't be that way on all things. I think where we need to really look closely at it is where the government interfaces with private citizens, where it's providing services, delivering goods or services to private citizens. I don't think the government has shown itself to be particularly good at that. And let me give you a couple of suggestions here. In the private sector, and I've had a fair bit of experience now over the years in this, we're often looking at what are the pain points in the customer relationship with our business. Why do we do that? Because if we don't do it, somebody else is going to come along and steal our customers. So we have to be very focused on what are the things what's the customer experience like? That's the key to success. Public sector, where there's no competition for some of those goods or services, less concerned about that consumer experience.
Yep.
I mean, can you imagine in the private sector people lining up overnight to get a passport?
Well, no, although we do have some airlines that make it feel like they're run by government offices. So what I would say is absolutely there's that sort of customer focus that you might lose. I guess what I'm wondering also is there's a temptation, John, for people to say that you also lose efficiencies, that if government ran more like the private sector, they would worry more about saving money and the bottom line mentality. And yet we worry about introducing a for-profit mentality into things where it doesn't normally exist. And that can range from highways to healthcare. Where is the line on deciding how you introduce that sort of mentality without tipping over into introducing a profit motive where you may not want it?
Well, I think it is important to remember that the broad role of government is for the public good. And that is not the role of business. In some cases, businesses are trying to reach a variety of stakeholders. And we've got this whole development that you've talked about on your program about ESG and how businesses are increasingly concerned with the environmental and social and governance aspects of what they're doing. Mm-hmm. That, you might say, is a public good. And it's an important element for business to consider because increasingly investors are looking for that as part of their overall performance, not just the bottom line, but also their ESG performance. You might say on the government side, it's really all about ESG. It's all about how we meet the needs that the public has for broad good governance, responsible management, thinking about how the future will unfold.
Generally speaking, are we trending in the right direction, or would you say we're trending in a poor direction? How's Canada doing?
Well, I think it depends on the sector. I think we've been very rigid in what is now the top issue for Canadians, which is healthcare. We've been rigidly doctrinaire. We compare ourselves, we think, favorably to the United States, but we neglect to compare ourselves to the Nordic countries or to France or Germany, where for less money they get better outcomes. And I think part of that has been that we have been very rigid in our formulation. So we haven't shown ourselves to be good at adapting ourselves to changing trends and changing events.
Right.
On the other hand, I think that we have shown that, as Michael Warnock was saying just before on your program, dealing with the complexity of a federal system in which we have multiple languages, multiple cultural groups, and 10 provinces and three territories, I think we've done a pretty good job of producing one of the finest countries in the world.
John, so good to have your voice on this. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Amanda.
John Manley is a senior advisor at Bennett Jones and a former deputy prime minister and finance minister. Well, one thing we know for sure about government at every level, and that it's important because it delivers some of the most relevant services to all of us, but also because it does things that the private sector won't. So why is it that when it comes to big, complex projects, governments seem to trip over themselves? Lisa Raitt is vice chair of global investment banking at CIBC Capital Markets and former deputy leader of the Conservative Party. Lisa, great to have you with us.
Thanks, Amanda. I'm glad to be here.
So there are endless examples, and we could say it's the CF-18 fighter jets. It doesn't really matter what example we pick. The question remains, are our governments, and especially our federal government perhaps, especially bad at big, complex projects, or is it just that they do so many of them and these are episodes, as we hear?
I don't know if they're bad at it. I would put it this way. Now that I've been on the other side, they certainly have a lot more, I would say, stakeholders that they have to take into consideration in developing a procurement project. If you're in a big company, it's a very simple thing. This is what we want. This is how much we're willing to pay for it. Put out the bids, you evaluate, and that's it. The government is very, very different. First of all, getting to an understanding of what you want takes a whole lot of time. Secondly, you got to test to see if everybody's okay with that, what you're asking for. And then you got to be fair and equitable in which way you go out and try to procure it. And then finally, it's not just about whether or not you're buying X. It's about what economic benefits are you going to spin off from this investment of the taxpayer dollar. So it's a big project, and politics is the last piece that comes to play. Mm-hmm. And I think the odious one, that's the one that shouldn't play in procurement, but unfortunately it oftentimes does.
Yeah, so that's actually where I wanted to go, because now you're at a big bank. The banks also have a reputation for being bureaucratic and slow to, sometimes to respond to things, and there's lots of processes. I imagine that it's not dissimilar to dealing with bureaucracy. It might make you perfectly suited for it. And then you throw in this additional little layer of optics, politics, PR, however you want to phrase it. How complex is that to try to push towards a goal?
So it's interesting. In the bank, of course, all the process and bureaucracy is in place in order to quantify risk and make sure you're taking appropriate risk. In the government, it's a little bit different. It's about making sure that you can secure that vote in the general public. Governments, politicians are very self-serving. When they see a massive procurement deal, they wonder, well, what can I get out of it for my community along the way? The greater good, of course, for Canada, but as well, everybody wants to make sure that this plays well in terms of a vote getter. And I don't care what political party you're talking about, that is a truism. They want to take the benefit for whatever project is happening. Right. And I think a way around it, Amanda, quite frankly, is adopting something that Australia has done on military procurement, and that is just to have an all-party kind of committee that is there to usher through these kinds of procurements. Once the procurement is decided upon, then the committee works together in order to fulfill it. And that way you're kind of blunting that impact of politics.
All right, one last really quick question here. But of course, thinking for the future is a problem when politics is involved. People want the answers that are in their electoral term. How do we change that? How do we make the decision-making longer thinking?
You got to go back to the electoral side of it. For Canadians to say and deem that this is something that's important, that it's unacceptable, it's taking us so long to equip the men and women of the Canadian forces, that it's unacceptable, it's taking us this long to get other kinds of things into the hands of Canadians that we want to have. You really have to have that revolt at the ballot box, or you need to have a government that's willing to see it in a bigger way, and that is inclusive of other parties. I think it has to come from an outside source as opposed to altruism of politicians.
Such good perspective, Lisa. Great to have you. Appreciate it.
You bet.
Lisa Raitt is vice chair of global investment banking at CIBC Capital Markets and former deputy leader of the Conservative Party. Coming up, never mind how government runs its own business. How easy is it to do business with government? That's still ahead. But first, the Phoenix Pay system was introduced in 2009 to modernize the federal government's payroll software. It was supposed to cost about $300 million and save $78 million a year after it was in place. Instead, Phoenix disrupted pay for up to 80% of the federal civil service, and it's still not functioning properly. The aim is to have it sorted this year at a total cost of $2.2 billion. You might just laugh if you weren't crying. We're back after this.